Lawrence Edward Rodney,
Do you, Lawrence Edward Rodney, swear that the evidence that you shall give in this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do, so help me God.
Thank you, Mr. Rodney.
Your name is Lawrence Edward Rodney.
My name is Lawrence Edward Rodney.
Do you mind telling us how old you are, Mr. Rodney?
I'm 73 years of age. 73.
For the purposes of this exercise, is it correct that you submitted a written statement
Yes, I did.
and that statement was signed by you?
It was signed by me, yes.
Did you also sign another type of document in relation to the death of Walter Rodney?
I did.
And that document is the evidence that you gave at a coroner's inquest in February 1988?
Yes, it was. One of them.
Prior to signing those two documents, did you verify that the contents of the documents were true and correct to the best of your information and belief?
I did so.
If you were to see the originals of those documents that you signed, would you be able to recognize it?
I would, yes.
And you could recognize it by its contents and your signatures on it?
Yes, I would.
I wish to show the witness these two documents with the permission of the Commission. You saw those two documents this morning, Mr. Rodney, shortly before taking the witness stand.
Yes, I did.
And are those the two documents you're referring to?
Yes, yeah.
Mr. Rodney, I would like for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, Walter Rodney, and that immediate family.
Well, I don't know if we can do it a little bit, but we'll try. We'll summarize it. Walter is my younger brother, the one after me. I'm his elder brother. We both resided for some years at Lot 18 Ben Street, working Russ. Initially, we both attended St. Stephen's Church of Scotland School, if I recall correctly, under the headmastership of Mr. C.B. Giddins. We grew up in that area. That is to say, the area of Working Russ, Wortmanville, Durban Street, Norton Street, Ben Street, Leopold Street, and so on. Walter, however, was somewhat bright. Perhaps that's an understatement. And he gained a scholarship to Queen's College. At a relatively young age, I think of 11 plus. Walter went to Queen's College and he did well. Subsequently, he gained perhaps some kind of reputation as a debater, as someone who had potential. and he came to the notice of perhaps the elites in Guyana. Other than the sort of scholastic achievement, we both had an interest in sports. I recall football, soccer, cricket. We both supported, I think, at that time, DCC, Demerara Cricket Club. Yes. And Walter himself showed a prowess for athletics. Of course, that was in the school situation. I was later made to understand that he became a part of the Queen's College Cadets. And he gained, I think, the Patrick Dargan Shield for debating, which then, at that time, I don't know about now, was the kind of prestigious award that you get for scholastic achievement and for debating. I think I could stop there. I don't want to go further than that.
No, that's okay. You mentioned that your family home was in Ben Street.
18 Ben Street, yes.
Now, could you tell us how close that was to the Georgetown prison?
Well, actually, it was a stone's throw. The prison was to the exact, if you proceed due south, and Ben Street ran adjacent to the prison. You had Ben Street, Durban Street, John Street, and Camp Street, where we lived just opposite the prison. So the prisoners would come out of jail sometimes and do work outside, and we would speak with them, that kind of proximity.
Thank you. Can we now move on to your association with your brother Walter Rodney in a political sense?
Yes. Well, whilst we were both at school, actually, because the family, at least my father, was a member of the People's Progressive Party. He was a sort of organizer, if you like, for the PPP. So we both had that kind of early influence. But apart from perhaps going out and doing things like distributing PPP rosettes, we didn't have any relationship of a political nature that could be defined as such. It was a kind of incubation, if you like. However, subsequently, whilst Walter was doing his research, I think in London, at the London School of Oriental Studies, we did associate politically, myself and Walter. We both spoke at that time in the 60s, whilst Walter was getting ready for his PhD results. He'd already taken the PhD exam or test, but he was waiting for the results. And we both spoke at Hyde Park Corner. We both went to, if you like, student meetings at the West Union Student Center in Ealing, Collingwood Road, if I recall correctly. We both went to, if you like, Pan-Africanist kinds of events. And these were political. Subsequently, Walter went to Tanzania. So that relationship was more or less broken, politically. At a later stage, however, whilst Walter was in Tanzania, I was also with him. And my association then in Dar es Salaam could have been described as being a temporary one. Walter's engagement was with the University of Dar es Salaam, the University College of Dar es Salaam. And Walter was associated as a lecturer, and he interacted with many African students who would have been members of or supporters of the TANU party, which was the ruling party in Tanzania. He spoke with them. There were workshops, there were symposiums, and Walter was engaged in that kind of association, that kind of relationship. But I wasn't, because my stay in Tanzania, as I said, was temporary with the Zimbabwe African People's Union, otherwise known as ZAPU. So I was with ZAPU, Walter was with the university. I worked with ZAPU for some time, did some work for them, mainly sort of instructional work up country, speaking with students. But Walter was based in Dar es Salaam, working with TANU in a scholastic academic role. So the relationship politically then, again, wasn't very close in that sense. One, in Guyana before I left to go abroad, and two, in Tanzania. However, after Walter came back or returned to Guyana.
Can you give us an idea when he returned to Guyana?
Well, actually, he came after Pat did, his wife, and that would have been sometime in 1974. 1974, yes, I'm almost certain, yes. So after he returned to Guyana, then the political association became more meaningful, became more structured, if you like. Walter, at that time, was lecturing, speaking, and there was a general, if you like, interest over the question of his being appointed to the history chair of the University of Guyana. At that time, however, I was not associated with Walter at an academic level because my linkage was with the Working People's Vanguard Party. At that time, managed, if you like, or chaired by the late Brindley Ben. Walter respected Brindley Ben, but Walter was mainly with the university, if you like, element, speaking to people, meeting people, until such time as the formation of the Working People's Alliance. Well, then is where the political linkage became, if you like, more intense. Previously, it was more loose, and it became more intense with the WPA's formation.
The linkage between yourself and brother became more intense.
More intense politically, yes, after the formation of the WPA. However, one thing and another, politics being what it is, the WPVP, of which I was linked with, organizationally, came out of the WPA. It exited from the WPA, and I went with the WPVP. But I still maintain relations with Walter, very close. I saw him regularly. But we were not part of the WPA organizationally then. I also worked with GAU, which was the industrial union, the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union, at an industrial level.
And this would have been during what period?
Okay, this would have been from 1974, 75, going into 76, onwards. Okay.
You had earlier mentioned that you were in England
Yes.
at some stage. Could you indicate to us the main reason for your being there?
Well, like so many other Guyanese, the main reason was an economic reason, economic factor, seek employment. However, we worked, some time, and then joined the Royal Air Force. I joined the Royal Air Force and served in the Middle East for 5 years. Not the entire 5 years, but 2.5 years.
During what period were you in the Royal Air Force?
That would have been from 1959, around about April, to 1964, around about July, roughly, mid-1964. From 1959 to 1964.
During your stint in the Royal Air Force, did you receive specialist training in any area?
Well, you receive, first of all, what is called trade training. Basic training first, and then you get your trade training. But depending on a number of other factors, you're selected to go what is called a specialist course. And then based on your education, you can become a technician or a senior technician. But when you're in the Air Force or the British Army, if you're black, you have to be very good to reach that level. And I mean, I'm being quite frank with you. Huh?
Please do.
And because of my, perhaps, I don't know, perhaps it's because of the way how I carried myself culturally. And I was able to pick up and learn the local dialect, which is spoken in Cyprus, which is Greek. I was able to pick up sufficient. They brought me in to work or to be trained as a signaller. So the signals course was based on a number of factors, as I said. And there were other factors. For example, if you're good in boxing, if you're good at athletics, if you're good at sports, and you're black, you're brought in. And you're given certain, if you like, additional benefits because you're a good sportsman. So they want you to be utilized as a good sportsman, and yet your service as a serviceman is still important. But you get special services, you get special benefits, put it that way. I was brought in and given the training as a signal operator. So that answers your question. Yeah.
But what would that operation entail? What was a signal officer?
Well, you have to work, first of all, as a team. You operate a radio set, different kinds of radio sets at that time. And at that time, the normal culture would have been NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's the system that they had. The radio sets I became familiar with were the same ones that at one time the GDF had here in Guyana. That's in the 50s, of course, late 50s. These were sets that mounted in a castle and fitted into a vehicle, either a Land Rover or any other soft skin vehicle, because you have different types of radio sets. You have radio sets for the soft skin vehicles. You have radio sets for the armored vehicles. You have radio sets for tanks, mobile tanks, armor. Those radio sets are more durable. They're more, if, for example, you go into the water, if you're in a submersible, and that set becomes wet, it can still work. But I wasn't part of that kind of thing. I was part of the more, if you like, soft skin, armored personal carrier set. So that's the training I had. You had different types of sets.
The type of radio set that you became acquainted with, could you describe it more in a more scientific fashion?
Okay. Well, as I said, I was an operator. And the operator worked as a team. You had a center which was called a call center. And at no time was the operator permitted to go into that set, because the set had what is called a code. And that code, unknown to you or unknown to the operator, could be changed at any time. So you only went to the set to hook up the batteries, put the power on, make certain it's working, put up the area, and listen for your call sign. That was the extent of my operations. To go into the set had to be taken away from where it was based to another place, and then the technician will dismantle it and go into it.
The training you received, was it sufficient for you to learn about the components, the internal components of any particular radio set? Or
Not
radio
really.
sets in general, I see.
No, not really.
Right.
You could learn about the components by reading, but you were not permitted. It was forbidden to go into that set because it had a NATO code. And if you broke that code, well, the whole system will go.
You are acquainted with the functions as opposed to the components of the Harris Porter radio set?
Not really. Not really, no.
Do you have an idea how? Well, let me not press you if you're not aware of it. Can you move on now, please, Mr. Rodney, to whether or not you supported Walter in his political endeavors in Guyana in the late 70s and in 1980?
Basically, yes, I did. In the sense that Walter's program, based on the WPA Constitution, people's power, mobilizing the working class, yes.
Well, can you be a little bit more specific about the different ways in which you supported Walter, your brother, during his political activities?
Okay. Well, to be honest, I was a kind of liaison, if you like. I recognized that the WPA had come upon the scene at a very difficult period of time. There was an acute shortage of many basic items. Workers were being laid off. Things were very difficult. And I thought perhaps one of the best ways that I could support Walter was to be a kind of liaison, because I had the experience of working before he came back to Guyana with the WPVP. I spoke at public meetings. I mobilized people for support. I went amongst communities, not throughout the country, but I had a better understanding of what was happening in the community. So I worked as a kind of liaison to assist Walter in whatever way we could.
During this time, can you tell us which political party were holding the reins of power?
Well, there was only one political party holding the reins of power at that time, the People's National Congress.
Would it be correct to suggest that the struggles of the WPA were in opposition to the People's National Congress?
Yes. Yes, it would be.
You have already mentioned that you testified at a coroner's inquest in 1988. I wish to now bring you to that period that led to the death of your brother, Dr. Walter Rodney. I noticed you touching your file. Is there something in your file
Well,
you
it
wish to
could
refer
well be
to?
that I have a copy. I'm not certain. Anyway, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, can you give us a little information about the days before and the days following the death of Dr. Walter Rodney?
Okay. And I think I'll refer to much of what I said in my statement.
Please do.
On the Monday preceding June the 13th, I happened to be in the vicinity or the proximity of Lee's funeral parlor. I went there to view the body of Barbara Odle, the wife of Morris Odle, who had died, who had passed away, and was being buried from Lee's funeral parlor. I saw the body, and as I was moving towards the Umanayana, because there was a Soviet exhibition, art exhibition on it that evening, and I thought it'd be a good thing to go there, because culturally and otherwise, I don't miss art exhibitions. And as I was proceeding along Lamahorn Street, I saw Walter.
When you say Walter, you're referring to
Walter Rodney, yes. But he didn't stop, neither did I. I assumed he was going towards the funeral parlor. I made my way to the Umanayana. I had a look at the exhibition, and then I did a review. Now, one of the things I used to do was to prepare, if you like, resumes, which I expected he would go through. I prepared a review, and I took it to his home. I left it there, and then I saw him the next day, Tuesday. And that was the last time I saw him alive. I mean, Tuesday, sometime around earlier than that, because the clocks had changed during that period. The clocks had changed. You had an hour's difference. So I saw him around about 4 o'clock on Tuesday. That was the last time I saw him alive. But there's another set of, if you like, a parallel set of events which we could go into perhaps at a later stage.
The Tuesday you're speaking about would be the 10th
Yes, it
of
would,
June 1980?
that would be, yes.
Can you tell us the manner in which you first learned of Walter Rodney's death and where you were?
Okay. Well, to be truthful, the way I learned the method that was utilized, I was in the Brickdam lockups. The police had arrested me on the evening of the Friday of the 13th.
This would be the 13th of June 1980?
That is correct. And held me, if you like, in custody. It was part of more or less of the operation. And I learned of Walter's death the following morning through a radio broadcast. It may not have been a Demerara radio or Radio Demerara, but it was a radio broadcast that was being played on the police radio upstairs. Not a radio, just an ordinary radio. And I learned, and the words used, the body of a Negro man had been discovered in a vehicle. And then I lost that other part because I was being taken by the police from one point to another. So I learned about Walter's demise or death at that time in the lockups.
Prior to being locked up, did anyone tell you the reason for being arrested?
Well, yes.
Could you
The
tell
evening
us?
of the evening of the Friday, whilst I was being held upstairs in what more or less is the CID room, which I recall being very sparse. I don't know, I've never been to a police station and seen an office so sparse. I don't know. Anyway, the police officer in charge, I assume he was in charge, just said to me, said, you're being held here pending a charge of murder. That's why you were being held here.
And this would be,
Friday of the 13th of June.
were you informed as to who you had allegedly murdered or when?
No. I only learned who had been killed the following morning, as I told you earlier.
Yes, but okay. Before going to the police station at Brickdam, can you tell us a little bit about how you arrived there? At what point were you arrested and at what?
Okay. All right. I was actually arrested or invited to accompany the police because the arrest really was made at the station.
I see.
It's a technical thing here. I was invited to go to the station with a group of policemen, plainclothes policemen. And when I got to the station, I was told then that I would be held.
Before we get to that, when that invitation was extended to you,
Yes.
were you of the opinion that you had a right to decline the invitation to go to the police station?
Good question. The general mood at the time, anytime there were searches being made, either by policemen or non-military ranks of the state sector, was that it was advisable to cooperate and not to give any opportunity to them to react and frame you, if you like. So I knew that I had done nothing wrong. I knew that what had come to the house for that evening, I didn't know why, but I knew that they had come there for some purpose. And so I went along with them. Invite me, I've done nothing wrong. I told them, but I'm coming back. I just told her, I said, I'm coming back just now. I had no idea that they would arrest me.
You had previous experiences with the members of the Ghana Police Force?
Yes, while speaking at meetings, public meetings.
Could you give us an idea about that?
Okay. From around 1972, going into 73, 72 definitely, we spoke at public meetings. And the police would come up to us and ask my name. Who's the speaker? Who's the first speaker? Who's the second speaker?
What type of public meetings, if you could?
Well, basically, these were public meetings held around Georgetown, but sometimes over the West Demerara. Meetings for political purposes, where there will be no more than 50 to 100 people, because the WPVP was a small party. And I don't think at any one time we had more than 150 to 200 people attending our meetings. But to answer your question, the police would have an engagement with me, record my name, listen to what I had to say, and other speakers. And so that developed. So from that period, I knew that whatever you said to them, they would record it. At least this is what the impression you got. And so I had that kind of a engagement, if you like, from that 72, 73, 74 period before Walter returned to Guyana with the police.
Okay, we're at the stage now where you are in custody at the Brickdam police station. Eventually you would have come out of such custody. Can you tell us a little more about your period, your time there?
Okay, but before I go on to that, I must let you know that when I was told to go down into the police lockups, the guy just said to me, well, you know, he indicated with body language. And there was a sergeant there by the name of, I think, Vibert Asana. He drew his
Say that name again, please.
Vibert Asana. He drew his service revolver and he just held it, you know. The signal was clear that if you're going to run away or jump through the window or whatever, you're going to get shot. So I went to the lockups. So I stayed there the Friday evening, Saturday, Sunday, until Monday midday. But interestingly enough, there were some other persons there who had done nothing. They just happened to be in the vicinity. One guy was on a bicycle.
In the vicinity of
Ben Street.
Where you were arrested?
No, where Walter had been killed, if you like. Yeah. He was riding past. So when I got to the police station in the lockups, I met him there. And he just told me, he said, well, I was going home. And they locked me up. So you were at your home and they brought you here. I was going home too. They brought me here. So there was that kind of situation. But then afterwards, when I came out on the Monday, I think there were one or two reporters who had come into Guyana for a conference, not a conference, for the trial. There was a trial going on at the time. They called it WPA 5. And one of them managed to remain and had a word with me. And I just went and I spoke. I think I went to Gao because I was working with Gao. I wasn't with the WPA. I had no interaction with the WPA whatsoever. I was at all times with Gao or the PPP. You know. So I went and I discussed the matter with Dr. Jaden, you know, after I came out of the lockups. And he just told me, well, this is part of what happens.
Now, you mentioned that at the time, and this would be sometime in June 1980, there was a trial, a WPA trial that was ongoing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, actually, I wouldn't say a WPA trial. It was a trial of persons who were members of the Working People's Alliance. You recall what was called the Gaisuko Annex fire. The Gaisuko Annex fire. There were persons who were allegedly involved in that incident. And there was a trial going on at that time. So there were reporters who had come into the country for that purpose. I was held ostensibly to prevent any access of those reporters with myself. Because everybody wanted, well, who is Edward? Edward is in the lockups, so you can't speak with him. You know.
If I could be so bold, the trial that was ongoing at the time was in relation to the offense of arson of the building you speak about?
Alleged arson, yes.
And Walter Rodney was one of the accused persons?
He was, yes.
At what, in June 1980, you have any idea at what stage that trial was, or?
Okay, I think there was an appeal. My memory will have to be refreshed. I think there was an appeal, and the appeal had yet to be concluded.
Just wondering, Counsel, whether you'd be kind enough to extract from him the name of the others who were...
Thank you. Guided you, Mr. Chairman. You happen to know the names of the co-accused?
Well, to be truthful, if I remember correctly, it was called the Arson 5, or the WPA Arson 5. So there'd be 5 persons in addition to Walter. One of them, if I recall correctly, would have been covered by the name of Apata. I think that's the name he went by. Apata. Another one would have been, I think, Omawali, 2. Another one would possibly be, I'm not certain, even though she may be released, Karen D'Souza, I'm not certain about that. But I know definitely Omawali and Apata, together with possibly 2 others, and Walter Rodney.
Was Narayan one of them?
Pardon?
Was Roop Narayan one of them?
He could well have been. He could well have been. Could well have been. But I wouldn't say definitely yes.
That first name, can you be kind enough to spell it for us?
Apata, A as an apple, P as in papa, A as an apple, T as in tango, A as an apple, Apata. It's a Nigerian name.
Thank you.
I thought you would have said T as in tambourine.
No.
I see. So, in June 1980, there were ongoing legal proceedings for arson against Walter and a few other co-accused.
Yes.
After your release, can you tell us what happened?
Okay. As I said, I went to Gao. I spoke, I think there was an officer there, can't remember who it was, but I spoke with him. Later on, I was asked to go and speak with Dr. Jagan. I recounted to him my experiences. He asked me if I needed anything. And then I just went back to where I was. And of course, I held myself ready if at any given point in time for any eventuality, because Walter had been killed and there was a general crisis in the country. But perhaps I should also add that the identification process for Walter's body had taken place before I was released. But after I was released, I went to Gao, which was at that time in Vision Street.
Is there any information that you can give us with regard to the actions and activities during 1978, 79, and 1980 in relation to either the Guyana Police Force, the Guyana Defense Force, the Guyana National Service, or the Guyana People's Militia?
Uncle, you sure you don't want to go with one at a time?
If you have information, can
Give
you
them a
start
mouthful.
with the activities of the Guyana Police Force? Can you give us a general overview on the activities as from personal experience of the Guyana Police Force? You've already gone into a little bit of it. Is there anything else you wish to add to that?
Yes, we could perhaps surmise and be as accurate as possible. The experience that was general, the general experience was that the police force at that time was acting as an arm of the ruling party. I mean, there are other opinions, but that was a general impression, and it was backed up by concrete acts, practical experience. The police was being used to break up strikes. They were being used, people, for example, who were standing in lines and being unruly or waiting to get bread or whatever, or kerosene, there would be mounted policemen keeping them in order. You know, the mounted policemen keeping women in order, waiting to get flour. In a more political sense, however, the police was also used to intimidate. There was an intimidatory element about the police force. However, there were some professionals amongst the police force, and that tended to impart a kind of balance, if you like. So if you knew how to move, you could avoid any direct contact with those elements who were antagonistic and who were violent and who were acting directly as arms of the state. Because if you knew the professionals in the police force, you could be decent with them, you could talk with them, you could engage with them, you could even bargain with them. That's the police force.
Now, the strikes that you mentioned that were sometimes the police would break up, those were peaceful strikes, or there was need for police to break it up?
Okay. Well, the strikes that I'm referring to would be the strikes engaged in by the Bauxite Workers Union, the workers at Guyana stores here in, I think, the vicinity of Church Street, Guyana stores at that time, and strikes organized by workers, not necessarily trade unions. Workers organized the strikes, and then the trade unions came in and gave solidarity in the sugar belt. And the police force was used at that time, the brown clothes we used to call them, to intimidate these workers. However, because of the Constitution of Guyana, anytime you have a strike, there's a definition where a police presence is required. Not necessarily to break up the strike, but policemen have to be there to keep order. But the police were used in many occasions, together with the House of Israel and other strike breakers, to intimidate workers.
Tell us a little bit more about the manner or the methods used by these persons to break up these strikes.
Okay. Well, that's a broad definition. Okay, let me take one example. The strike at Guyana stores. You would have workers of picketing, workers moving along a picket line, and then a vehicle will come up. And out of the vehicle will come policemen. And then another vehicle will come up, drive up, and will come non-uniformed elements who you're not certain who it is. Could be policemen, could be House of Israel, it could be young YSM, anyone. And they will start attacking the workers, pulling the pickets out of their hands, you know, the peaceful pickets. So it was a very, very complex situation. The police is there to keep order. And at the set time, the workers are being attacked and intimidated, and nothing is being done. So it's to break up the picketing demonstration, break up the strike. In Linden, however, one has to be more careful, because at Linden, the workers were locked up, actually locked up, and at times beaten. But then if one didn't see this, you can't verify it. You're going in hearsay. You see the guy with a black eye and a bandage, but you didn't physically see it. So, you know, that kind of situation.
Do I understand you to be saying that the police force did not participate in violent attacks against the strikers, but that they were present and did nothing to stop other elements?
That would be more or less accurate. The uniformed branch of policemen would not attack strikers unless there was a cause for it. For example, the police would attack you if they say, go into the vehicle and you refuse. Then the violence will be used. So there's a duality here. They wouldn't come out and start attacking you just like that. But if they say, go into the vehicle or stop picketing and you refuse, then the violence will be employed.
Can you tell us anything about the activities of the GDF in those years, 1978, 79, and 80?
Well, you know, the GDF is a different category because they are arm of the state, the uniform branch. Well, you would see the GDF, for example, going on exercises, running, PT exercises in the mornings, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. You see 6, 7, perhaps 12 ranks of persons comprised of 6. So you have about almost 70 people running along the road. These are exercises the GDF will be carrying out.
You have no evidence that the GDF played a part politically during these strikes and so on that you speak about?
Well, again, one has to have, you know, one must see this. But what I do know is that anytime there was a strike, jeep loads or vehicles containing GDF would go into areas, go into communities where the strike was taking place. For example, if there was a work stoppage at LBI, which is on the East Coast, you would have ranks of policemen going to LBI, Success, Better Success, Monrepo, and going into the villages, not doing anything, but just being present as a form, if you like, of showing the colors or being intimidated.
We're speaking about the GDF?
GDF, yes.
I see.
Guyana Defense Force.
Sorry, thank you. And by GDF, you're referring to the Guyana Defense Force?
Yes.
Not keen at all to stop the council, you're doing well, but he did mention the House of Israel, members breaking up strikes.
Yes.
This was what I wanted to make sure that you extract from him some
Can you give
information
us-
about this House of Israel.
Can you give us
What was it? What role it played? Who were its members?
Can you give us an idea about the activities of the House of Israel in 1978-79, as well as 80, especially in terms of their any association that they may have had with the Guyana Police Force?
Well, the House of Israel, as is generally known, was led by one Rabbi Washington. There was a hierarchy comprised perhaps of deacons and elders, both male and female. Elders, yes, thank you. Based in Albertown, where I think the offices or the structure still remains dilapidated, the House of Israel spread out to different parts of the country. Where I worked, for example, there was a House of Israel contingent, that is to say, the Ministry of Agriculture. I want to believe that the Ministry of National Mobilization would have also had House of Israel elements. Where I was employed in Monrepo, there were about 6 or 7, could be more, House of Israel types who resided in Triumph. So you had a central hierarchy and you had a community element. I want you to follow what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Monrepo, Triumph, and then there were House of Israel elements along the east bank of Demerara and on the west bank of Demerara, possibly the west coast. So the House of Israel wasn't just a concentrated element. It had different branches. Now, where I worked, they would sometimes come in their uniforms because they felt free, the red and black uniforms.
Can you describe the uniforms for us?
Okay, red top, sometimes with a green epaulette, and black. So red, green, and black. With sometimes they would have Star of David's, whatever, insignia. But that was the color of the uniform.
You know what the PNC colors were at the time?
Well, the PNC colors also, I think, were, if I remember correctly, sapphire, and places like the annex of the Supreme Court, the appeal court, green, red, and black.
The same colors as found in the House of Israel uniforms.
Same colors, yeah.
Can you tell us, you know the names of some of the persons that were in the hierarchy of the House of Israel
Well,
in those times?
It's difficult to know the names unless you're part of the organization. But what I do know, the term brother was being used a lot. You would hear brother. You would hear shalom. Shalom was being used. And perhaps other nomenclature or descriptive terms that they use amongst themselves. I had an experience, for example, at the public hospital, where there were a group of House of Israel selling plantain chips and peanuts. And they would come to you and just say, well, purchase one of these. If you didn't purchase it, they would get, they get anti. So you purchase it just to be...
If you didn't purchase what?
They get anti, they get antagonistic.
I see.
They were a kind of bullying type, if you like. They were sort of local bullies. Not everyone, but for the large part. Anyway, to continue about the House of Israel at my workplace, both male and female, young and middle-aged, and they would have children with them. It was a kind of, if not, you like, a sect. And this sect recruited people If you weren't a member of the House of Israel, they didn't attack you or do anything. But they made it very clear that they were privileged compared to other persons working in the same work site. During that period, we tried to get the workers organized, become members of unions. Myself and another comrade who lived in the East Coast, we mobilized the workers to join GAU because the workers were being victimized. There was no representation. And
the workers were being victimized by who?
By their bosses, the people who ran the operations. And they were being exploited. You had people working in a warehouse. You had weeders. You had people working in the seed bond. You had people working in different parts of Monrepo. They would work late hours and don't get their overtime pay, or have to go and ask for it. They have to come to Georgetown, go to the ministry building in Georgetown to get their money. So we tried to get the workers organized. That led to a very bitter situation, whereby they made it very clear that if you try to organize the workers, you do it at your own peril. This is the House of Israel now. A vehicle would pick them up and take them from the public road or from the line top, the old railway line, to the work site, because it was quite a distance to go in. You probably noticed yourself. If you were not a member of the House of Israel and that vehicle passed, and if there were 2 seats, they would not pick you up. But however, there were occasions where if I was traveling in a vehicle, a taxi, and they stopped the taximan stopped, they would join the vehicle and come along just as if they're ordinary, nothing wrong. It was a bullying type of operation. There was one particular deacon there by the name of Hamilton. Hamilton.
Do you happen to know the first name of Hamilton?
I can't remember his first name, but he's presently in the system.
Could the first name be Joe Hamilton?
It will be Joseph, yes. He worked there at Monrepo. As a matter of fact, he was the counterpart to what we were trying to do for the workers by getting the members becoming members of GAU.
What do you mean by counterpart?
Well, he was a kind of deacon, and he had the influence because he lived in...
Joseph Hamilton was a deacon
a
in the
kind
House
of deacon,
Israel
yes.
at that time?
He was a kind of senior.
Senior member?
Yes, yes. In other words, he had influence. There was a branch. There was a branch of the House of Israel in Triumph, one of the side streets. So he would be there sometimes, and at other times he would be at the workplace. But he made it very clear that if you try to organize the workers in the seed bond, the weeders, the people working in the nurseries, you're going to be doing this at your own peril. I'll leave it at that.
I'm not too sure that I'm much clear about the nature of this organization. Was this a political or religious quasi-political? Was it a trade union type of organization? Let's get some specifics. Who so constituted its membership? Does it still exist? Did it have political ties to any parties? I want some specific things. I'm not clear.
Do you have any information as to those many questions posed by the chairman?
Yes. Well, the learned Commissioner Chairman is quite right. One has to be specific. What I do know is that there's a body of literature, a wealth of literature perhaps, on the House of Israel. This can be accessed. However, this information doesn't give you the details about how the modus operandi, if you like, of the House of Israel. For example, if there were cases being heard in the Georgetown Magistrates Court, the House of Israel would take contingents of people and occupy almost all the seats. When there was the trial...
You mean ordinary cases at the Georgetown Magistrates Court? Or
not ordinary cases.
What type of cases?
Cases involving the WPA.
I see.
If there were magistrates' hearings of any matter that was political in the sense of being opposed to the PNC at that time, the WPA's, the House of Israel presence would be there. Additionally, the House of Israel operated not only as a religious or quasi-religious grouping, but also as a kind of hit squad. They were violent people.
A kind of what squad?
Hit squad.
What do you mean by hit squad?
Well, to be specific, you probably recall the murder of Father Darke, Bernard Darke.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, Father Darke was actually knifed to death in 1979 in Brickdam, not far from here. And his assailants were proven House of Israel members. Proven House of Israel members.
Proven how, if I may ask, and also since I have engaged, was the House of Israel in existence when the witness returned to Guyana? Can we get some indication of when it came into being? Thank you.
I'm going to pause so that those who may wish to go to the bath can do so. A brief bathroom break. Thank you. Those who are coming in from outside could get to their seats.
Which you had signed. I'll ask you to look at them. I'll ask you to look at them. I'll ask you to look at them now and verify that those were the documents you were speaking about.
Yes, these are the documents.
Please excuse, we are having some
Really haven't missed anything. We had a comfort break of about 10 minutes and we then ran into a technical problem with the microphones, but I think we've now resolved that and we're about to resume. Thank you, Councillor.
Could I be guided as to the stage we were at when we stopped?
I think we were last describing the House of Israel, or rather it was being described as a quasi-religious organization which operated as a hit squad.
Thank you.
I think we should take it from there.
Yeah, no,
Mr. Chairman, he had gone past that. He spoke about deacons and all that. But could I ask if he has identified the two statements?
I'm getting
Yes,
to that.
I have.
We'll move to that now. Thank you.
Yeah, I had hoped that you would do that at a more convenient point rather than break the House of Israel. But I leave it to you, Councillor.
At this stage, I wish to ask for the statements identified by this witness or the documents identified by this witness to be formally tendered, I believe, as LER1 and LER2. LER meaning Lawrence Edward Rodney.
And my understanding is that the statements you refer to are the ones dated
Yes.
if you could identify it by
Thank
date,
you.
the 19th of April 2014, and the extract from the testimony given in relation to the inquest by the witness in February
1988.
1988.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Could-
that's certified by him to be true and correct?
I'm guided, please, Madam Commissioner. I wish to ask for the signed witness statement, which is dated the 19th of April 2014, perhaps to be marked with the letters LER and the number 1. And the other document that I'm seeking to tender also has the same date, but it is a reflection of the coroner's inquest proceedings, and those proceedings were held in February of 1988. And we're hoping that you will ascribe the marking LER2 to that particular document. I think the witness has already given evidence that he verifies both of them to be accurate and that he adopts the contents of
And
those documents.
the two identification marks you suggested, LR1 and LR2?
LER, if it pleases you.
LER1 and 2?
Thank you.
They've been so tied, and I think we can continue now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Before you proceed, when we took the break, I had asked a question as to trying to date the formation or the existence, the initiation of the time of existence of the House of Israel.
I will now try to elicit that information. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Mr. Rodney, you are required to tell us if you do know about the early formations of the House of Israel. Are you aware of whether, you know when it was formed? Do you know whether it was in existence in the late 70s? And do you know whether it is in existence now?
Well, there's three parts to your query. If we deal with the second one, the House of Israel, to the best of my knowledge, came into existence when the Rabbi Washington arrived in Guyana, after he arrived in Guyana. And that would have been after 1971. Practically, and for the rest of Guyana, the House of Israel would have come on stream when they began their radio programs. Some years ago, looking through the old newspapers, the House of Israel had a radio program called The Voice of Prophecy. So it would have been roughly the latter part of 71, perhaps, onwards, coming into existence, with their own radio program, their own offices or headquarters, and their own, if you like, community of people, members.
In 1978, 79, and 1980, they were still functioning as an organization?
Yes.
Continuously?
The House of Israel in 1978-79, I recall there used to be meetings held by the WP where Walter Rodney would be present, or where Walter Rodney would be featured as the main speaker. These were massive meetings. Never before in Guyana had been so many people gathered to hear political discussions. After dark, or even in the early afternoon, thousands of people. The House of Israel would be used at times to try and break up these meetings. The WP at that time had worked out a tactic of surrounding their speakers with groups of people so that the House of Israel couldn't really penetrate. But still they would be there because evidently they had been ordered to be present or make their presence felt at WP meetings at that particular 1978-1979 period of time.
Are you aware whether this organization, if they're still in existence today?
In a much perhaps reduced form, because there's no longer, for example, the radio program, The Voice of Prophecy, but the structure that was used as a base, as a headquarters, still exists in Albertown. And from time to...
Where is this base located, if you please?
Albertown, Georgetown.
You know the precise address?
Well, if you go over Church Street, it's the next street after Church Street, on the very corner.
Going north?
Proceeding north, yes.
Would it be correct to suggest to you that this is in fact 6th Street, Albertown?
It is 6th Street, yes.
And it's located on a special part of 6th Street?
On the very corner of 6th Street and another street proceeding due north.
Would that street be Light Street?
Light Street, correct.
You know your counsel.
I grew up not far away, sir.
No, but could we have 3 specific questions answered? What was the purpose of the organization? Who constituted its membership? And did it have an established and distinct political association? I think we need those three questions.
From your position as an outsider to the organization, would you be able to tell us the
purpose of the organization?
The purpose of the organization?
Who constituted its membership? Did it have political association?
One would have to be very competent and accurate. But one could also surmise that the main purpose was to mobilize black people, black Guyanese mainly, for the purposes of a religious, quasi-political, quasi-religious, if you like, sect, where the motto, the credo was that this organization comprised of black Jews. These were a Jewish community of special Guyanese. That was the motto. However, the other purposes which the House of Israel served can only be answered by someone who researches it, because they were, as I explained earlier, there were different aspects, different facets to the modus operandi. But my impression was, in answer to your question, that it served the purpose of mobilizing and organizing black people as Jews.
For specifically a religious purpose or for other purposes?
Ostensibly for religious purposes,
That's it.
because they had services and they had a radio program, and they, they mobilized in a religious sense.
Who's that question again? Do you know who constituted this organization? Some of the membership? I think I've asked that, but you've given us the name Joe Hamilton.
Okay.
You've mentioned Rabbi Washington. Can you mention any other names?
As I indicated before, there was a hierarchy. You would have Brother Tellman.
Say that again, please.
Brother Tellman. I'm just using that as an example. You would
But
have
this is not an actual person in the
No,
in the
no,
House
this is
of
not an actual person. But you had a rabbi himself, Rabbi Washington, and you had the queen, who was supposedly either his concubine or his spouse or his wife. So these were the top of the hierarchy. And then you had a motley set of persons whose names you really wouldn't know unless you were part of the organization. Because as I said, it was a sect, and no outsider could get that kind of information.
Are you aware of the House of Israel having any political affiliation to any particular party? In 1978, 79, and 80?
Yes, definitely the People's National Congress.
Can you give us an idea of how you came to that conclusion? You've spoken already about the activities of the House of Israel at WPA meetings. Are you aware of whether the House of Israel might have been involved in PNC meetings as well?
Okay.
And if so, in what capacity?
Okay. Well, I've never been to PNC congresses or biennials. I've never been there. So persons who've been there would know whether or not WPA contingents were present. But what I do know, because I've actually seen this, is House of Israel contingents in columns marching in TUC May Day parades alongside of the TUC affiliates that were pro-PNC. Additionally,
By
anytime
TUC, you're referring to what, please, sir?
the Guyana Trade Union Congress.
Thank you.
And the May Day that I'm referring to is the May Day Labor Day parade. So you would have contingents of trade unions, and you would have the House of Israel, and you would have other elements proceeding along the same. And at massive rallies held by the PNC at the Square of the Revolution or Coffee Square, there would usually be a contingent of the House of Israel.
Did you ever hear of the House of Israel membership breaking up PNC meetings in the way that you described they broke up WPA meetings?
No, not to my mind. No, definitely not.
In terms of the socio-economic background of these members, they were mostly laborers, industrial workers.
You've heard that question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've heard the question. I believe there are more questions.
Yes, related to that, he indicated that it was formed when Rabbi Washington came to Guyana. If you could explore that.
Do you know
more.
anything about Mr. Rabbi Washington's background? How he came here? Where was he from?
Again, Council, one could only go now on what one learns either from the media.
We do understand that.
Yes, okay. The Rabbi Washington, Edward Washington, came to Guyana after an episode involving himself and the U.S. law enforcement. I wouldn't be in a position to say what that episode was, but he came to Guyana subsequent to that. I think he was met by persons here in Guyana who would have been associated with perhaps cultural organizations or religious organizations. However, he soon became affiliated to the People's National Congress, very quickly. And eventually, he began broadcasting a radio program called The Voice of Prophecy.
Okay, if I may, do I understand you to be saying, first of all, that the person who you refer to as Rabbi Washington, do I understand you to be saying that he was a fugitive from USA, the USA justice system?
Yes.
Now, you said that shortly after returning, he would have a radio program.
Yes. A regular radio program.
A regular radio program. In those days, can you tell us how easy it was for persons in the general public to be allowed or to be given permission to host radio programs?
In the late 70s, even from the mid-70s, after the Sophia Declaration of 1974, it was almost impossible for any other entity other than some entity that was pro-government to be given a radio program. However, there were instances where, for example, the Libyans, the people who came from Libya, they had an organization in Guyana called the Call Society. And the Libyans were also granted a facility or a franchise to have a radio program. So the Libyans had a program that they call Islamic whatever, and the House of Israel had the program called the House of Prophecy. So that is the extent to which I can comment on that. I wouldn't know about the policy making. I wouldn't be able to say about the policy making in terms of actually making the decision as to who will get and who will not get permission, but it would be very difficult for any entity that was opposed to the government to be able to get.
Well, this leads me to the next question. As far as you know, the radio stations in Guyana, they were an autonomous body, or were they controlled by the government of the day?
Under the law, they were supposed to have the rights to be autonomous, but they were virtually controlled. Radio Demerara, they were virtually controlled by the government. By the government.
Meaning?
The PNC government.
Do you know whether the WPA were interested in hosting radio programs, or whether in fact they did host any radio programs during that period?
The WPA would not have been in a position to host any program that was controlled by the state-controlled media. They would not have been in a position. However...
Why you say that? Why do you say that?
Well, the main opposition party, the PPP, which had been operating for decades, couldn't get any real niche into the state-controlled media or radio. So the WPA, which had just come up on the scene and which had been declared to be, well, virtually a foe of the ruling party, could not have been given access. But what I'm going to go on to say is that they were, if you like, freelance operators who could record or who could interview WPA personalities, either in the region, that is, say, Trinidad or Barbados, or here in Guyana. And maybe, we don't know, try and get the program aired, if they could, on the state-controlled and dominated radio. Can I elaborate?
Sure.
Freelance meaning persons who have the technological capacity could come and interview the WPA leaders, do a radio program, interview it, put it together, edit it, and then try and see if they can get it broadcast. But I don't know if that happened.
Did you ever hear any such interview being broadcasted in the state-controlled media?
Never.
Correct. You've said to us two things. You've said to us that the Rabbi Washington came to Guyana, and shortly after his arrival, he was hosting a radio program.
Yes.
You've said to us also that the WPA came into existence, but because they had just come into existence, you felt it was impossible to host a radio program. Can you come to a conclusion based on those two scenarios?
Okay.
Would you agree that preferential treatment may have been given to the House of Israel?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. There's no doubt about that.
Anything else in the House of Israel? I'm not sure if we've exhausted all the information that we need to elicit from this witness in regards to the House, or whether your answers have been satisfactorily dealt with the House of Israel issue.
I had asked about the composition of the membership,
Oh,
but I
I'm
got the
sorry.
impression that they were working class people.
Was the membership of the House of Israel drawn from any particular grouping in Guyana society?
Well, it was a sort of multi-class, in a sense that you had persons who you could identify by the uniform, the attire. As I mentioned earlier, the red and black and green. And then you had other elements drawn from places like, say, Old Boys Town, Agricola, Baggersville, Baggettstown, BV, Plaisance. Now, these will tend to be persons who were not necessarily part of the productive process, in the sense that they didn't go to work on a regular 5-hour or 6-hour day basis. They would have been people selling in the market, but still working. They would be people who sort of had farms, or partially did farm work, or were engaged in non-farming activities, but still worked. So categorically, to categorize it, they were workers, but not in the sense of being members of trade unions, having a trade union consciousness, an organizational commitment, and a loyalty to an organization other than, say, a trade union.
So they were workers, but not in the true 9-to-5 sense.
Right. They were, if you like, a sub-proletariat, basically. I think that's the term that is used to describe and define that social class. But still, you can't discriminate. They're workers, in the sense that they work for a living, but not the accepted working class movement per se.
I think I have a clear view of what was earlier called an amorphous class.
I didn't get it clearly.
I think I have a clear view of what was earlier described as an amorphous class.
An amorphous class. Just to touch a little bit more on the activities of the House of Israel during WPA meetings or strikes. Can you describe in greater detail when violence was used by them, what actually this would constitute? Were weapons used? Was it, what methods were used to disrupt these proceedings?
Usually, and the practice was, if a meeting is going to be disrupted, there will be, first of all, a group of House of Israel operatives. They'll be transported to the site in vehicles, either Land Rovers or whatever, or minibuses. And they would attempt to intimidate the speakers, cut the wires. Cut the wires meaning the wires to the loudspeaker equipment. Or, in some cases, they would throw missiles, meaning bricks, small bricks, and sometimes medium-sized bricks. In extreme cases, they would lash out with sticks, which they had with them, and start beating you or beating people at the meeting. That was the extent of the intimidation. And they could only have done that once they'd been given orders. But I think another point you need to note is that on such occasions, very few, if any, of the persons involved in this kind of incident wore uniforms. They were always in civilian clothing.
So how would you come to the conclusion that they were members of the House of Israel if they were not in uniform?
Good
Was there any
question.
way of you
You had,
recognizing them?
you had to identify them from seeing them in uniform previously
I
and
see.
then seeing them out of the uniform.
I see. So would it be true to suggest that several times when you saw these House of Israel operatives, you would have seen them in uniform at one stage,
And
and,
then out.
therefore you would have been able to recognize them
That is
even when they were out of uniform?
That is correct.
Would you be able to say, can you recall seeing any member of the House of Israel with arms, with that sort of weaponry?
Well, here again is the names that you can't really identify, but I've seen on more than one occasion a House of Israel operative in uniform and out of uniform. For example, I mentioned Hamilton, Joseph Hamilton.
Yeah.
Gregory Smith was also a member of the House of Israel. Or I've seen him in the House of Israel attire.
Okay,
Mr. Rodney, just for clarification, you had told us earlier that there would be a police presence at these meetings, and you are now painting a picture in your words that House of Israel members, whom you described that you would see in uniform before and then and after, and that's how you identify them, they would disturb these WPA meetings. What action, if any, would the police take against these so-called members of the House of Israel who were disrupting the meetings?
Good question. Learned Commissioner, it depended on the size of the meeting and the venue. For example, if the meeting was held during daylight hours and the WPA had managed to provide a kind of canopy around the speaking equipment, around the speaker, around the podium, then what would happen is that the police who were present, either on foot or on horseback, that is mounted policemen, would have some form of control. But this control was always relative, because the WPA, the House of Israel, did not respect the police. The police couldn't really tell them anything, if you follow what I'm getting at. So the police were there, but they were virtually, if you like, neutralized in terms of controlling, if the House of Israel choose to do so, any violent behavior.
That leaves it hanging for me. I like to use common sense. Police have more arms, and they usually have the support of the state. They would have horseback, they would have canisters of tear gas, they would have sidearms. If you say that the House of Israel members only had sticks, how would they overpower the police? Either there was cooperation by the police with them, or the police turned a blind eye, or some such thing. But clearly, the police could have been in a superior position to control the crowd, or those who misbehave.
Learned Commissioner, again, a very good question. Whenever the police were there at public meetings, the police usually had their brown uniforms or their blue and black uniforms. They were physically identifiable. But the size of the crowd, always, the police themselves virtually could not really control riotous behavior. And that means that even if they had arms on them, they couldn't take out those arms and use them because it was in a highly built-up area. And if they're operating in a highly built-up area, it meant that the House of Israel could utilize that set of circumstances to carry their activities. because the police is incapable of using their arms against them in a highly built-up area. You don't pull out your gun and try to stop anybody in a crowd of persons of 7,000 or 8,000, if you follow what I'm getting at. So it was that kind of contradiction in answer to the Learned Commissioner.
Yes.
The police had their arms, their sidearms. They didn't have tear gas because no riot, it's just a meeting. But they couldn't use their arms in a highly built-up area for a number of reasons.
I understand. To raise the issue in a different way, Mr. Rodney, and because of what you have earlier testified about, were you able to say whether it appeared that the members of the Guyana Police Force were acting in conjunction with members of the House of Israel?
Absolutely.
As opposed to in opposition to them?
Absolutely. Save and except where there were professionals who would perhaps try and see if they could do something. But for the most part, absolutely.
And the reason you formed that opinion is because of the inactivity. Well, you tell me. The reason that you may have formed the opinion that the House of Israel and the Guyana Police Force may have been acting in conjunction with each other during these meetings.
They were
Well, did they ever attend these meetings as a joint group? Did they arrive at the same time?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, perhaps I should have done it ab initio from the beginning. But it's clear that the council, your council, is leading the witness. Obviously putting the conclusions and questions to him, etc. And all he's doing is yes or no at this time. I'm not sure is that we would be proceeding in that vein. Because everything that he's answered yes or no to is the council's opinions and conclusions. But he has a bundle of contradictions on this area anyway, which I will deal with when I examine him. But I don't know, the council is allowed to just go on putting leading questions to his witnesses?
Counsel, you've heard Mr. Williams' objection, and I'm sure you'll be guided hereafter, though I must say that I got the impression that the witness, Mr. Rodney, was not disposed to accept anything other than his own view. I agree with you that at times conclusions were put to him, but I've noted along the way too that he didn't always embrace the conclusion. But be guided, you'll be guided by Mr. Williams.
I thank Mr. Williams for his observations. Mr. Rodney, suggestions that I put to you, you are aware you don't have to agree with them. I asked you about what evidence you had that the Guyana Police Force may have been acting in conjunction with the House of Israel when these meetings were being carried out. Could you, without me suggesting answers to you, even if you had mentioned it earlier, could you give us a reason for forming that opinion?
Well, there's a rationale. Anytime there were public events sponsored by the WP or even the PPP, and House of Israel elements were present either with their placards or with sticks or just shouting or just having a presence, the police never would approach a House of Israel operative and restrain them. So it would appear, at least to the outsider, to the external observer, that the police had strong reservations about restraining House of Israel operatives. And these would be public events that people would see. Everybody would see that. So it's not something that you have to make up. You're actually seeing this.
Thank you, Mr.
I have counsel, perhaps we could find out from the witness about how many meetings he witnessed House of Israel, he himself, witnessed House of Israel interrupt or break up or intervening, would that be in the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s?
Can you give us an idea of some of your personal experiences?
Okay.
I
And
just
whether
want
you
to
in
know how
fact
many.
witnessed, how many, oh very well, how many such beatings you may have observed?
A quick estimate would be between 6 and 7, and I could quickly enumerate them. The Weiser Row and Durban Street, Light Street, approaching East Street, Kitty Market Square, Merriman's Mall, which used to be at one time called Boderman, and possibly La Penitence, opposite Twins Drugstore.
You were present at all of those meetings
Present
and
at
saw
all those-
that?
Yes, witnessed that.
And what year or years would this have spanned to you?
This would be, learned Commissioner, between the period of 1977, 78 of the referendum into 79.
Thank you. And my final question, I know the witness is not omnipresent or omniscient, but is he aware personally of any prosecutions brought against any person he was able to identify as a member of the House of Israel for assaults and or destruction of property as he has described occurred at these meetings?
Are you aware of any House of Israel member being prosecuted, arrested, or charged for any acts of criminality at any of these meetings?
Well, not necessarily at the meetings itself, but there was one incident, or if you like, an episode that occurred with the murder, the stabbing to death of Father Bernard Darke, where the Rabbi Washington himself was amongst those who were arrested for that affair. That was in 1979.
Can you recall whether that incident led to charges being brought against anyone?
The charges were brought against Bilal Atto, if I remember correctly, and Rabbi himself, Washington. Bilal Atto.
Atto?
Atto, A as an apple.
Who
T as in
who was this Mr. Atto?
Bilal Atto was, well, he was possibly a House of Israel from outside of Georgetown. But he was a House of Israel operative.
How do you know this?
Well, from the court proceedings, he was taken to court. It became a court matter.
No, how do you know that he was how do you personally know that he was a member of the House of Israel? How did you?
There was no denial that he was a member of the House of Israel,
There was-
together with Washington. When Rabbi Washington was arrested and Bilal Atto, there was no denial that Bilal Atto was a member of the House.
You had ever seen him before?
No, I'd never seen him before. But I'm just answering the learned commissioner's question.
Was the allegation specifically made in court or out of court that he was a member of the House of Israel?
You've said to us that he never denied. Somebody, was he ever accused of being a House
Yes.
of Israel member?
Yes, he was.
How, when and how was he so accused?
It was in the public domain. It was in the press.
Thank you, Mr.
Come to Justin, further to an observation, I don't know quite, it was an objection that was taken by made by Mr. Williams. Just want to attract his attention to paragraph 34 of the Rules of Procedure dealing with oral examination, and it is said that paragraph A, 34A, the Commission or Commission Counsel may examine the witness at any stage of the proceedings. The Commission or Commission Counsel may choose evidence from a witness by way of leading or non-leading questions, so that under the rules within which we are operating, a leading question is not an objectionable one. And I just thought that I'll draw that to his attention, and I'm grateful to your learned junior Commission Counsel who attracted my attention to this provision. Yes, and that is not unique to this Commission of Inquiry. That's fairly consistent with commissions of inquiry. What I tried to make yesterday, the point that it's not a courtroom. Leading questions, opinion, evidence, hearsay, all of that is permitted. We are trying to get at the truth. However, at the end of the day, the commissioners, with our collective experience, will determine what weight to give to the evidence.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, do you say it's 34A?
Oral examination, 33A.
Oh,
33A, I'm sorry, yes, 33A. I might have misled you, I'm so sorry. 33A.
yes, I now see that, but all I'm saying is that I didn't intervene because of the starting of leading questions, but I believe that when you reach a point where you're actually trying to force the witness to accept your conclusions, that's at the stage that I mentioned, I queried. I know that he could ask, but for every question or most of the questioning ought not to be leading questions.
Yeah, I don't think we need to carry it any further, except that
Yes.
I don't think that the witness that is before us is going to accept anything put to him that, in his experience and judgment, doesn't represent the reality. But please proceed, Counsel.
Yes.
I believe now is an opportune time, with permission of the Commission, to move from the House of Israel on to other organizations that I was...
I'm very sorry, but when we, as the commissioners, intervened, the witness had been speaking to individuals who he had identified as being members of the House of Israel. And the last name he had called was one Gregory Smith. And I was interested to know why he had made that association and or link between this person, Gregory Smith, and the House of Israel. Before you move on, sir.
And just before we conclude the House of Israel, I had asked a question about its political association, if that was known. Was it connected to any political party, directly or indirectly, if that was known? So perhaps we can have the two questions addressed before we leave the House of Israel.
I thought that we may already have covered that political connection. But is there any further evidence?
Yes, there is an
Did you-
elaboration that is required.
Yes, will we be grateful?
The learned commissioner quite rightly must have recorded when I refer to Gregory Smith, also known as Cyril Johnson. I first met Gregory Smith in 1974 at a public meeting. At that time, this was before Walter, just about the time after Walter came back, or around the time. And he was not in uniform then. He was a much younger individual. But from what I could see and experience with him was that he was there for a purpose. The words he said to me as I was stringing the wires from the speaker to the microphone was whether I wanted to have a meeting, a real meeting without police. This is his words to me. Do you want to have a meeting without police? This was Gregory Smith, 1974. Subsequently, I met him again. Again, not in House of Israel uniform, but at a disco nightclub. He was working then as what is called a song mixer, mixing songs. The environment was one where there was colored lights. In other words, it wasn't like as this, but I distinctly recall recognizing him sitting as a disco operator at a particular nightclub. I think the nightclub was called the Buccaneer Cove, or it could have been the Oasis. Previously, I had also seen him, and this was in the 72 period, at a similar nightclub disco bar called the Green String. Again, he was working as a kind of disco radio, if you like, playing the software for the music and the lights. However, with regards to seeing him in uniform, This would have been in 79, roughly. Early 79 perhaps, or mid 79. Because it was during the summer. It was very hot. And I saw him walking due north along Russell Street together with a female and an infant, a child, in the House of Israel uniform. Now, that was the first time I'd seen him in that attire. It didn't mean necessarily that he was part and parcel of the normal composite of House of Israel members, because I'd never seen him at public meetings. I only seen him that one occasion in uniform. It could be that he put on a uniform for that purpose, I don't know. But I did see him in the House of Israel uniform on that particular day, one occasion.
Was that the sole occasion?
Pardon?
Was that the sole occasion?
This only occasion, solitary occasion.
The various sightings that you had of the person you now describe as Cyril Johnson or Gregory Smith, at the time of those sightings, you were aware of his name?
No.
Or was he just a face that you remembered and later put a name to it?
That's right. I wasn't aware of his name. But the impression was there from the first encounter, if you recall what I said. The impression, a strong impression that this individual was part and parcel of either an organization or a group that was there to disrupt meetings, to bring violence to meetings. His words again, and incidentally, that particular meeting I'm speaking about at Durban Advisor was subsequently broken up.
Which meeting is this?
Durban Advisor. It was a WPVP meeting, Working People's Vanguard Party. It was a kind of solidarity meeting for Walter Rodney. Working People's Vanguard Party, PPP, PYO, a number of organizations, but the WPVP had sponsored that meeting.
And how did he eventually make the link between this person whose face he knew and the names Gregory Smith and Cyril Johnson?
Could you repeat, Learned Counsel?
The question that the commissioners wish to examine is what may have caused you to remember this particular person when you saw him, and how did you eventually know that these sightings of this person was the same person?
Okay,
that,
good question. Yes, you were saying?
by name. How did you know him by name eventually?
Okay.
How were you able to make that link?
Only after his name had been disclosed in the Catholic Standard, and I was able to have a close scrutiny of the profile and compare it with another profile.
What do you mean by profile?
Facial
photograph?
features. A photograph, yes.
I see.
A printed photograph.
In the Catholic Standard.
Catholic Standard, yes. And there was another magazine taken of Gregory Smith, an image of him when he was in uniform at, I think, one of the UK electronic schools that he attended.
Okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Are you saying to us that you saw a photograph of that person you had seen a few times before?
Yes.
And the newspapers or magazines in which you saw that photograph, the name Gregory Smith was ascribed to the photograph?
Yes. In both cases. Both
And
the
you
newspaper
mentioned-
and the journal.
and
Both the newspaper and the journal.
And you mentioned that you saw him dressed in a uniform in one of those photographs.
Not
Can you
in
tell
one of the
us-
photographs. I saw him on the street, Russell Street.
You did tell us that, but I think you also mentioned a moment ago that he was dressed in a uniform and you felt that that was a uniform he was wearing when he was attending courses in the UK. I think
Yeah,
you
the
said.
uniform, okay, that uniform that he was wearing when he was attending courses in the UK was a uniform of the army.
Which army would this be, please?
It would be the GDF.
The Guyana Defense Force?
Yes. By that time, he was a non-commissioned officer. By the time he became a non-commissioned officer, he had gone to the UK for an electronics course. And therefore, the uniform that he was wearing then was not the uniform of House of Israel, but the uniform of the GDF.
Thank you.
I think the chairman had wanted to know, well, if you could give us an idea of the political affiliations, a little more, elaborate a little more on whether you knew about any political affiliations of the House of Israel. If you could elaborate a little bit more, if possible.
Well, save and accept to say that the House of Israel, as an organization, anytime they came out into the public, the posture was of such that it was very clear that they were there as strong loyalists of the ruling party. That is as far as one could go in terms of being political. The posture that they had, their public demeanor was of such. There was no doubt whatsoever that they had loyalties to any other political organization other than the People's National Congress.
These multiple postures, and the multiple postures of which he's speaking about were reflected in what? Breaking up meetings and whatnot.
Can you elaborate on
Yes, the learned chairman has a point. By posture, it is meant, for example, shouting slogans, or down with the WPA, or down
Give
with...
us an example of some of the slogans.
Well, you know, these are rhetorical. I mean, it could be anything. Down with the WPA. We don't want Rodney. Rodney this, Rodney... You know, rhetorical things.
Give us an example of some of the slogans that that may have stood out.
But that is exactly what he's doing, Councillor.
Yeah, you did
Down
give us
with
two.
WPA. We don't want Rodney.
Yes.
Are there any more examples that you can give us?
No, not really. I mean, I'm trying to be as accurate as possible. I'm
We
trying to put
appreciate
it in a
that.
particular context whereby it's not blurred. We don't want it to be blurred. For example, there would be meetings held, let's just say, Border Green. As you approach Border Green, you would hear people speaking, and these would be people speaking against the WPA. But they would be people not in uniform, not in the House of Israel uniform. So you have to assume that they're either supporters of the House of Israel or supporters of the PNC or both. But when you got to the meeting itself, on site, then is where you came in contact directly with the House of Israel, out of uniform, with the apparatus that I just described earlier. So there's two parallels you have to look at. The approach as you get to the meetings and what actually took place once the meeting is taking place. Especially if the meeting is being very popular and the people are clapping and showing acclaim. Because they didn't want that. The purpose was to disrupt meetings of the opposition.
You didn't notice the members of the House of Israel clapping
Not
at
really.
these Rodney
No, they wouldn't
meetings.
applaud. They wouldn't applaud.
or not?
No.
Yes,
You also mentioned the YSM. Can you explain to us what those letters stand for?
Well, the YSM is a nomenclature for Young Socialist Movement. At least it used to be. Young Socialist Movement,
And
which is the youth arm of the People's National Congress. Or was.
Do you know if the YSM is still in existence today?
Well, up until a couple of years ago, I think it is now being described under a different nomenclature, a different description. I think it is now called the Movement or the Youth Movement for Progress, something like that. But it's no longer called the YSM, but it's still in existence. It's no longer called the YSM, but, you know, the socialist doctrine or the socialist ideology as practiced and adhered to decades ago no longer pertains. So there's that change being reflected in names of groups that are affiliated to the PNC reform. They're no longer called the YSM. An answer to your question.
Can you give us an idea what, if any activities, the YSM membership were involved in in the years 1978, 1979, and 1980?
Not for 1978, 79, previously, 1974, 73, 72. I don't know about the period that came towards or after the referendum. After the referendum, the YSM, the association, and the insights that I had was at the earlier period. They used to break up meetings. One of the things they would do. They had other activities, sports, for example, tournaments, but their political purpose vis-a-vis the opposition in the 72, 73, 74 period was to break up meetings. But they had other activities. They engaged in political rallies, they had sport tournaments, they had educational activities, but vis-a-vis the opposition.
So you have no recollection of the YSM breaking up meetings in the 1978, 1979, and 1980?
No, I definitely would say I don't have that recollection. The early period, yes.
Council, if we are moving on to a new issue, I was just wondering whether this would not now be the convenient time at which to have the mid-morning break.
Before we go on the break,
Certainly, yes.
if you will allow me, please, Mr. Chairman, I have another witness who's just entered the room.